Okay, so there's a lot of discussion on what makes a country rich, what makes a country poor, and there's different narratives on the right and on the left and everything. And obviously, some people say, oh, some countries are poor because of colonization and because of, I don't know, oppression or because of geography or whatever. But I feel like for every single one of those examples or theories, you can give out like very clear exceptions. Like countries are rich because like they have a lot of resources. Uh, sure, it kind of makes sense when you consider like the U.S. or Australia, but it doesn't make sense when you consider like Japan. Like Japan does not have a lot of natural resources, and it's still really rich, and it was even richer in the past. Um, or Venezuela is rich in resources, but it's not actually rich. So like natural resources, like it's not enough. You know, like you could be rich. Norway is rich because of that. Australia is rich because of that. Uh, Saudi Arabia or Dubai, you could argue, are rich because of that. But it's not enough. Like it's not enough reason to to justify some countries being rich and others being poor, exactly because there's exceptions to this rule generally. Obviously, in general, having natural resources is going to help your country out, obviously. Uh, Second, like I said, because of oppression, uh, it kind of follows a logic narrative, but still kind of doesn't. Like, who did Singapore oppress? Like, oh yeah, Singapore, notoriously oppressive and all that, or Hong Kong, or uh, I mean, Japan definitely oppressed other countries, but arguably it got rich after it stopped doing that. Like into the 1940s, it wasn't really that rich, and even if it was absolutely bombed. I mean, Japan, Italy, Germany. Uh, you could argue Italy didn't really oppress that many countries, not in like a typical colonial way. It did have colonies in Africa, but it didn't last that long. And anyhow, all those countries after 1945, they were done. Like they were destroyed. They were really effed up, and they still got rich after that. Who do they exploit? Who's the victim here? Same for South Korea. The U.S. obviously people say it's imperialist in its own way. I'm not gonna argue with that, but there seems to be like exceptions to the rule. So maybe it's not oppression that makes countries rich. Maybe it's not natural resources. Uh, so what is it? What? Uh, sorry. So what is it? And what I think it is, like honestly, is it's just like a the sum of good and bad decisions that people in the country are making. Like I honestly think that countries are rich or poor, with exceptions, but countries are overall rich and poor because of good and bad decisions that they've made. And sometimes some countries are not making that good decisions now, but they're living off good decisions that they made in the past. Uh, One country that I think is a good example is Australia. So, like I said, I don't believe Australia is rich because of natural resources. Uh, it's one of the factors, but other countries with even more natural resources are still poor. So I don't think that's the reason. I think Australia had a very sound founding. I'm going to talk about it in other videos. I've already talked about it as well. But like they saw, they were independent in 1901. They saw the U.S. that had been independent for over 100 years, and it was growing like massively. They saw the UK, which obviously they had very familial ties with the UK, and the UK was the superpower, like the global superpower at the time was the UK. And they saw Switzerland, which I believe wrote its like first more solid federal constitution in 1848. And they saw that, and they literally just took like the best aspects of like each system to a point where like the Australian government like and political system today is absolute genius. Like it's just it works perfectly. It's a very sound government. It has a bicameral legislation, contrary to, for example, the UK, which has the House of Lords, but it doesn't have that much power. Like it took a strong Senate like the US. It took the direct initiative and referendums for constitutional amendments, which is Switzerland is notoriously known for that. It's very interesting. It became federalist like the U.S., but it denied Bill of Rights, which in the case of Australia actually makes sense because uh, countries like you writing down list of rights that you have doesn't actually guarantee that you have the right. Like if you go to Russia or the Soviet Union, for example, they had a lot of rights. They were like, you have the right to food and to accommodation and to being treated fairly and to freely express yourself. But like, if you write it down, but you don't have a sound system to overlook it, that makes no difference. And so Australia kind of denied that part, but it subscribed to federalism, to a strong Senate, but with, for example, a parliamentary system instead of a presidential system, which is very efficient for the executive government, because you know that the executive is always going to be aligned with the legislative, which just makes it so politics flow a little like quicker. Like I said, it took some things after Switzerland as well, and those good decisions just kind of set Australia for success, pretty much, like it really did. And it's not a guaranteed thing. It's not like, oh, that's 100% sure. Uh, One thing that I think they messed up is like they centralized taxation too much. So if you compare taxation in Australia compared to the US, for example, or especially compared to Switzerland, or even compared to Canada, like states kind of live off grants from the federal government, which kind of undermines federalism. Because like if I need your money, I'm gonna kind of do whatever I need to do to get that money from you. And so the federal government has a lot of leverage here, which it doesn't always use. And obviously, it tends not to use it in an appropriate manner. Let's call it that way. But I think countries are rich because they made good decisions over time. Like the average of decisions that each individual makes over time is good, and obviously there are bad decisions as well. But uh, and then they live off that. And I think Europe has really just lived off good decisions that are made in the past. If you see Italy, for example, it kind of liberalized after World War II. It was uh, growing fastly, and then it started stopping making good decisions. It started to stop making good decisions, and it's stagnated. And it's still like an okay country to live, but it lives off its past. It doesn't live off its present anymore. And on the other hand, Poland, for example, or I don't know, Singapore, they've been making many good decisions now in the past 30 or 40 or 50, or in the case of Singapore, 50, 60 years. And it shows. It's starting to show. And so, whereas like 30 years ago, Italy was already kind of going down, but it was much better than Poland and Singapore. But the culture for success was in certain countries. Like the culture for success was already in Singapore. The culture for success was already in Poland, but it wasn't in Italy anymore. And so you see how like that kind of pushes countries down and or up or pulls them up or whatever. And I think Italy's and even Germany's, France's case, the UK's case, for example, it's very interesting because like they've been clearly getting worse. Like at least for the past 20 years, they've been getting worse. But like, who oppressed them? Like no one oppressed the UK. No one oppressed Italy. Definitely not in the last 20 years. So how did it get poorer? And the answer is like they've started making bad decisions. They've started making less good decisions and more bad decisions. And fundamentally, that's what it's going to be about. Obviously, like some people are going to say, "Oh, it's about freedom, it's about liberty," but like fundamentally, it's about like what you do with your life and how you vote, but also how you act and the values that you espouse. Like you have a saying in this because it's going to be your work ethics and your morals. Like, why does nobody steal in Switzerland? Obviously, it's because uh, this is overblown. Like some people do still, there are thieves everywhere. But like, why overall is it that if you go to Singapore and you leave your phone out on the table, no one gets it? Like, yes, it's because of police and all that, but like, it's more than that. Like, it's culture, because they don't have police everywhere. Probably Singapore would be one country where if you actually do take the phone, nothing's gonna happen because everyone's gonna assume that the phone was yours. So like, countries with a high level of trust, they actually incentivize people to not be trustworthy and to kind of hijack the system, because the system overall trusts that you're doing the right thing. And so why does that not happen, or at least why does it not massively happen in New Zealand or in Singapore or in Switzerland or in, just sound, fair, trustworthy countries? And yes, it's because of policy, but it's also because like of decisions that people are making every day to be moral, to be reasonable, to be sustainable. And fundamentally, it's the individual morality that outgrows into culture, that indicates and defines policy, that not tomorrow, not in 5 years, not even in 10 years, but over 20 and 30 and 50 years time actually creates a wealthy society. And yeah, that's what I was trying to say. You can comment down below if you agree, but I see you next time.